Hello and welcome back to Mom's New Identity. I'm your host, Amber Ivana. Let's get into this episode.
Yo soy la madre, I'm the creator. Yo soy la reina, I am the maker. You can bow down now or bow down later. I don't need you to be my validator. I am the healer, la curandera. I'm starting fires, don't need madera. Deep as an ocean, light as a feather. Bring on the dragons, I am the slayer. Madre, creator, I am madre.
I'm your host, Amber Ivana, and this is Mom's New Identity podcast. First, let me say I'm glad you're here. On this podcast, my goal is to help fellow mothers redefine motherhood on their terms. How would I do that, you ask? Great question. By having honest, vulnerable, and sometimes even uncomfortable conversations about parenting, motherhood, childhood trauma, and mental health. We do this so we can challenge the ideas of what society tells us we're supposed to be and do as mothers and as women. My hope is that when we as mothers begin to heal and be true to ourselves, we can begin thriving instead of just surviving. So if you saw my post on social media, you'll see that this episode actually today is going to be about ADHD, ASD, or the abbreviation for autism spectrum disorder, and unmasking, specifically in women. And there's a reason why I chose that title, or I made it specific to women, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But before I jump into this episode, I want to first thank you for being here. If you're a returning listener or viewer, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you are new here and you haven't yet, be sure to follow the show if you're listening to this on podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button as well as the bell notification to get notifications whenever I post. Whenever I post a new episode, it will be posted on there. So, and I really want to hear from you, my listeners, viewers. What did you take away from this episode? This episode is going to be very information heavy. So I want to know what your, takeaways. What did you learn? What did you take away? Did it kind of open your eyes to certain things? Do you feel like it just solidified certain things for you when it comes to possibly being diagnosed with ADHD or ASD? Once this episode is over, be sure to leave a comment under YouTube with whatever your takeaways were from this episode, or you can leave a rating, a review. Reviews are always appreciated. As I start to acquire more reviews and such, I'll make it a point to review those and read those out every episode, just to give special shout outs to those of you that really just took the time to leave me a kind review. I'm not going to read the mean ones. Okay, I'm just not doing that. But also I have started, as I've mentioned before, you can find me on Instagram. I pretty much decided to make it more or less like a community page so that there's different posts on there, fun memes, different quotes from the episodes. I'm focusing more on engaging in my stories. So let me know, what do you want to know more? Do you want to do like Q&As, polls, things like that? So be sure to follow that page. I'm also on TikTok, so really just Instagram and TikTok, with a whole TikTok possibly being banned. I haven't focused as much of my time on TikTok, but you can also follow me on there if you choose. So next thing, disclaimer, okay? I have to, because I'm talking specifically about different diagnoses when it comes to mental health and things like that. Just a reminder that I am not a professional, okay? I am not a licensed therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. And so this episode is not a replacement for an official diagnosis, okay? This is more so for educational purposes. It's really meant to bring awareness to certain things when it comes to the diagnoses, and really just some of the learnings about it. So again, just for educational purposes, this is not a diagnosis. And so if you do feel that after listening to this episode, you kind of hear some things that really resonate with you, or maybe you relate to very strongly, it could be a sign to get an official diagnosis if that's what you choose. So again, if a lot of what I share on here sounds familiar to you, or maybe has, I guess, piqued your interest as far as whether or not you may or may not have either ADHD, ASD, or a combination of the two. Do your research. You don't have to go straight to, a licensed therapist to get an official diagnosis. There's actually a lot of information out there, just different channels from both licensed experts as well as people who have spent a lot of time really just studying these diagnoses, or maybe they have them themselves, and so they share their firsthand experiences. So at the end of this video, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll also list it in the show notes. I will have a playlist for you that I created of the videos that I watched on YouTube that really helped to kind of give me a little bit more insight and education on my diagnosis of ADHD, as well as the possibility that I may also have ASD or be on the spectrum of autism. But one thing you should know about autism, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is that it looks very different for every individual person. So just know that. So if someone shares with you that they have a diagnosis, and I don't have an official diagnosis, I have researched a lot. One of the channels that I will mention later in this podcast, actually, she is a licensed doctor, actually has an assessment you can take online. And it's meant to really help you get an idea if maybe you're showing signs or you score really high on the assessment. Really, if you score within a certain range, it's a good indicator that you could possibly have a certain diagnosis, whether it's ADHD or to be on the spectrum for ASD or autism. I'll just say autism if that's okay, because I feel like it's easier than ASD, and not everybody knows what ASD stands for. So again, there's going to be a playlist of videos that I have referenced just to make it easier for y'all to kind of do your research. And from those videos, you might find other videos that pique your interest, or just other channels and such. But the first question, or the main thing I guess I should touch on, is what is ADHD and ASD, also known as autism spectrum disorder? What are those things, and why the hell am I talking about it? Well, if you didn't gauge, or if you didn't guess, I have officially been diagnosed with ADHD as of last year. Actually, I think it was at some point in this year after my son was born. So it's been within the year that I was diagnosed with ADHD with my therapist. And as far as autism spectrum disorder, there's a good chance that I'm also on the spectrum. But I've also noticed, or I did notice even before getting a diagnosis of ADHD, that there seemed to be like an ongoing trend of women or mothers or just like mom creators that I followed talking about how they have ADHD. And like, I was just like, man, why does everybody have ADHD? Like, what is going on? Like, that's really what it seemed like. And so I don't know if you've noticed this, or maybe you have seen videos, or maybe you're scrolling TikTok, because TikTok is wild, and that it will sometimes show you content that is very curated for you and very like directed towards you. And it's almost like it's like holding up a mirror to you, like, hey, this is you, just so you know, like the algorithm is showing this to you because we think that this is for you. So yeah, it's really interesting how that works. So going back to it, ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, they are neurodevelopmental disorders. They start really early in childhood, and they affect how your brain develops and functions. Another term that is often used for people who have these diagnoses, they consider, or they don't consider themselves. Another term that's often used in that community is neurodivergent, sometimes abbreviated as ND. So if you've seen that, like neurodivergent, I've heard people call it like neurospicy. Yeah, neurodivergent is basically when you have any sort of neurodevelopmental disorder. And ADHD and ASD are not the only neurodevelopmental disorders. there's other ones. And there's actually, so this definition of it, or this explanation, this is not like my own. I actually learned that from a video that I have included in the playlist for you all that I mentioned earlier. So that's really what they are. Now, as far as ADHD and what I'm learning, so probably a handful of years ago, ADHD was there was two different names that people often used in terms of this specific diagnosis. It was ADHD and ADD, so attention deficit hyperactive disorder or attention deficit disorder. That is no longer the case. They're not two different ones. It is now all under the umbrella of ADHD, and there's 3 types. So the first type is hyperactive and impulsive. The second type is inattentive, and the third type is combination. Okay. I am one of the rare lucky ones who happens to have combination. So that's lovely. And autism spectrum disorder, as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's a really interesting, I guess, disorder because it's so different, right? There's different, I guess, executive functions, as they refer to it. There's different executive functions that the brain is responsible for. Things like speech, or things like social skills or social interactions, things like I think cognitive functions, I believe. I'm not sure. That's just a few. I apologize that I don't know like the exact. This is why I put on the disclaimer that I am not an expert, because I'm clearly not an expert. But the thing about it is that like there used to be, it was often referred to as like low functioning and high functioning, and those terms are, I don't know that I want to say harmful. Maybe some people would agree that they are harmful. They're just not really an accurate representation of how autism spectrum disorder works. Because what people think is like you're like lower here and you have like, you can barely function versus you can function really well, but that's not necessarily the case. Like it's just that certain cognitive or executive functions in your brain either work overtime or are not working efficiently enough, I believe. And my apologies if this is not accurate. This is just my understanding, or I guess how I've interpreted the information that I've learned. I saw somebody share a pie chart that was talking about autism spectrum disorder, and rather than looking like, on just like a simple scale from like left to right, it was more like a pie chart. And within that pie chart, you have the different functions, or the different what are they called? The different executive functions that are impacted by autism spectrum disorder. And then there's like levels within each function that are either high or low. So because of that fact, it's very, very different for each person, right? Because some people may be high on one level and very low on another level. And so that's what makes it very unique. And I really didn't know that before. I always thought it was just like one end, high end. I have even used in the past terms like high functioning or low functioning. The term Asperger's, I believe, is also very outdated. That's no longer an actual diagnosis. That's just what I've heard and learned from different channels. So again, do your own research. Go seek out expert advice if you really want to learn more about this, okay? But it is helpful to do the research beforehand, because it kind of gives you talking points for when you're, going to actually seek expert advice, because you can point to certain videos or just certain things that you have learned that are indicators of why you may or may not have a certain diagnosis. Okay. So, because I know, I don't know about y'all, but there's been times where I walked into a doctor's office and like I had this whole idea of what was an ass, and then the doctor's like, "You have any questions?" Nope. And like it just goes all out of my brain. So, it's helpful to have, just some information and be prepared to go in, so that when you go to approach a doctor, you can be your own advocate. Next thing, okay, how did I find out that I have ADHD? As I mentioned earlier, I noticed like a trend of just different moms talking about their ADHD and the things that they did. And I remember scrolling through my TikTok feed and seeing one specific mom talking about the things that happens when with her ADHD. Or it wasn't just hers. There was actually a handful of videos where they were talking about the things. They're like funny videos where they were talking about like, oh, when I do this and then that, and then I would notice that like the hashtags were always like ADHD in women, and I'm like, this is getting a little too close to home. Like this is pretty relatable. And so I started like looking more into the hashtag and researching it myself really before at the time I was actively working with a therapist. As of right now, I am not, because my therapist that I was working with, for a number of reasons, we stopped working together. She decided to focus on a different type of clientele, specifically children. So obviously that meant she couldn't work with me anymore. And we had also kind of met the goals that I had coming into therapy. And so because of that fact, she thought that it really didn't necessarily make sense for me to continue therapy because the goals I had set out for myself had been accomplished. Oddly enough. Okay. But I still need to be in therapy. I just feel like that. So anyways, yeah. So I saw so many videos on TikTok, and then I looked into different YouTube videos and I started Googling stuff, and I was like, yeah, this stuff checks out. Like, this makes sense. Like, I experience a lot of these things. And so I told my therapist, I was like, hey, I think I might have ADHD. Can we like talk through that and see if maybe there's a diagnosis there? So she said, okay, let's do it. Sure enough, question after question. Yep. Do you do this? Yep. Do you do this? Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Lots of yeses. And that was when I received the diagnosis of having ADHD combination type. And if I'm totally honest, it kind of hit me a little hard. I know it's not something that's necessarily anything to be ashamed of, but for me specifically, I don't know that I might have mentioned this in some of my earlier YouTube videos. I don't know that I've mentioned it specifically in the podcast, but my family has a handful of just different mental health disorders. My dad was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in his 20s. My mom has PTSD, probably complex PTSD, and just different diagnoses. Like, I believe she also struggles with anxiety and such. But it's because of that fact, knowing that my parents just really struggled with their mental health through most of my life, I really just avoided therapy, if I'm honest, because I was afraid of receiving a diagnosis. Like, oh, maybe you have bipolar disorder. And the thing about it, it's so ridiculous that I even thought that way, because the fact is, whether or not I was going to be diagnosed with something was irrelevant, because if I had something, it makes sense to get on top of it from the get-go, right? Like, how can I address whatever symptoms are a cause or a result of whatever diagnosis I thought I may or may not have had? How would I have been able to address those or manage those symptoms if I didn't even know that's what was wrong in the first place? And so if maybe you're feeling that way, like, oh, I don't know if I want to go to a therapist because I'm going to get diagnosed with something, there's nothing wrong with that. A diagnosis doesn't make you who you are. It's honestly just a part of who you are. And it's actually something that I think should definitely be embraced, because it's part of what makes you unique. But also, I think when I finally received the diagnosis and I started reflecting on my childhood, I started reflecting on just the ways that I have behaved in all of my life, even into adulthood, it became very apparent to me that I've always had that diagnosis. But the positive thing I will say is that because I realized, like, hey, some of these things are harder for me, not because I'm bad, not because I'm not good enough or I'm not trying hard enough or I'm quote unquote lazy. It's because my brain has a hard time doing this, literally. Like, the way that my brain is wired, it's more challenging for me than it is for the average person that doesn't have these disorders, or people whose brains are not wired like mine. In other words, neurotypical people. That's the term often used in that community as well, is neurotypical people are people who don't have those developmental disorders. Just some of the things that I realized I do and have done for most of my life as a person with combination ADHD. I'm going to read them off the list because I have a hard time memorizing sometimes, at least now. I tend to talk excessively, especially if I'm in the company of someone who allows me the space to do this. This is why podcast episodes are really hard for me to record sometimes because, funny enough, I already recorded this episode and it was a disaster. I kept talking on and on. I did not hit any of my talking points, and I literally had my outline right in front of me, and I got so mad at myself. I was literally so upset I started crying. Like, I'm not even gonna lie. Like, that's something that's really hard for me, and I get mad at myself. I almost overanalyze conversations. Like, did I talk too much in that conversation? And I've had people tell me that, like, you talk too much. I was told that as a kid, like, you talk too much. The next thing, I lose track of time very easily. If you look at my watch, I literally have alarms for every single thing. Like, I have alarms to remind me, okay, this is time for you all to eat lunch. This is time for your kid to go down for a nap. This is time for you to start their bedtime routine. Like, this is time to start dinner, because if I don't, I will just like not even have any concept of time. It's crazy, which is also why podcasting is kind of hard because the editing process is intense, because I got to cut out a lot of stuff that was not relative. The next thing, I tend to forget things very easily unless I find a way to remember. I have always done this. Like, I remember before I had kids, I worked for this advisor, and when he would send a bunch of things like for me to do, I would always tell everybody, send me an email so I remember. Send me an email so I remember. If you tell me right now and you don't send me an email, I will forget. And I got really good at remembering and knowing that that's what needed to be done so that I wouldn't drop the ball, because I hated making mistakes. And so my calendar, my alarm clocks are just like numerous on my phone. The next thing is, I often interrupt people in conversations, mostly because I worry that I might forget what I was going to say. Like, they'll say something and it'll remind me of something that I wanted to say. And then I just have this reaction that, oh, if I don't say it now, like, I'm going to forget that this is what I wanted to say. And I won't be able to get back to the conversation. Like, if you hear me and my dad, I'm pretty sure my dad has ADHD, he just hasn't been diagnosed. If you hear me and my dad talk to each other, like, we interrupt each other all the time. If you listen to our podcast episodes, it's not necessarily like that. We're pretty good at, like, not interrupting each other. We made sure to be intentional about that. But if we're just in everyday conversation, it's bad. The next thing, I can't sit down and just relax without feeling like there's something that needs to be done. I'm always like going to clean something. Part of that is just being a mom, I feel like. But even before that, like, I remember I just always felt like I needed to be doing something or working or moving around or like exercising. Like, I couldn't just sit down. Like, sitting down and just relaxing was one of the hardest things just for me in general, which is why, oddly enough, meditation was very hard at first. But it is possible. As someone who has combination ADHD, if I can do that, and it's literally feels impossible for my brain to do that, you can too. Okay, so go check out, I know I mentioned this in my last video, but, or maybe I didn't. No, I did. I forgot. If you want to learn about meditation and how to start meditating, I will link that video at the end of this, and I will include it in the show notes / YouTube description so that you can learn about that too, because I'm a huge advocate for that. The next thing, I get burnt out really easily as a person with combination ADHD. Like, I could one day be like super just energized and ready to go, and then all of a sudden I'm like attacking my checklist, like trying to do everything all at once, like full send, and then the next day I have zero energy to complete anything, and I'm done. It's actually something that's been really hard for me, and I have been very, very hard on myself about it because of the fact that all of the self-help and the personal development, all those years ingrained in my brain that if you're not consistent, it's because you're lazy, it's because you're not trying hard enough, it's because you don't care, it's because it's not important to you. And that really wasn't true. And it internalized a lot of feelings of shame and unworthiness in me that I'm now starting to finally undo and let go. Which reminds me, I'll probably do another episode very soon here about hustle culture and how I think that we as women, mothers, people, gotta let that shit go. So stay tuned. Let me know in the comments here or on YouTube. Send me on YouTube. Or on YouTube. No, on Instagram, send me a DM. Let me know if you want me to talk about that more. I'm happy to do that. Next thing, I have a hard time staying on task or staying on topic in conversations. That kind of goes hand in hand with the interruption stuff. I just am constantly like, oh, squirrel. So like if you're the type of person that when you're cleaning, it's like you start cleaning something and then it reminds you that you need to go do something else. So then you go do something else. And then that reminds you need to do something else. So you go like, it's really hard for you to stay on task. You might have ADHD. I've learned to manage that well enough to be able to like come full circle. The way I clean late, I've noticed as of recently is like, it's really weird. I kind of go in a circle. Like I'll work on something and remind me of something, but then I remember to go back to that spot that I was trying to clean. But it takes a lot of intentionality, to be honest. Sometimes I can be impulsive with my decisions, my emotions, and have unwarranted reactions to seemingly small things. Like really strong emotional outbursts are, oddly enough, like one of the symptoms of, I think, hyperactive impulsive ADHD really is that like I blow up at sometimes the smallest things. It might even be like emotional regulation might even be one of the functions of autism spectrum disorder. Don't quote me on that, but that's another thing. So the hard thing is that there's a lot of overlap on the two because of the nature of the disorder or the nature of the disorders. There's a lot of overlap. So there's a video that explains that, and I have also included that in that playlist for you. So you're welcome. So yeah, I can sometimes be impulsive with my decisions. I'll go out and like buy something because I'm like super motivated to start something and realize in retrospect, like I just spent a whole bunch of money on something that I never finished, that actually I never started to begin with. I have done that a few times, but my husband, on the other hand, is not like that. But I feel like my extensive experience in the financial industry has made me a little bit more mindful of my financial decisions for that fact. So that was actually something that I think that really helped me to not be so impulsive. Otherwise, I would be going ham. I would be going hard in the paint. You know what I'm saying? Like spending way too much money. The next thing is I'm always thinking about something or multiple things at once. Again, part of this is when you become a mother, you have the mental load of all the things, but it's almost like magnified times 10 when you have ADHD and feels kind of debilitating because you just like you're thinking about all the things you have to do, but then your mind is racing constantly. So it's like between the two, it's just emotionally exhausting, mentally exhausting to the point where you can become very easily overstimulated or the emotional regulation is very difficult. So that's definitely something that it really takes a lot of work to manage. And that's probably one of the hardest things I feel like. The next thing is, or I should say the last thing, as someone with ADHD combination, is that I become hyper focused or fixated on certain topics for a specific amount of time and then I lose interest. So like I'll be like super focused on something for maybe a couple of days, months, weeks, and then I'm like over it and I want to do something else. A perfect example of this is how my interest in finance and such, I feel like that was something that was very interesting for me for a really long time. And I've just kind of lost interest in educating around it. But the thing is, because I know how important it is and how limited the knowledge is on that as far as education goes, it is something that I do want to implement more in this channel, specifically around like just business and all of that. Because I do also do some bookkeeping on the side. Fun fact, just for a little extra money to fund this podcast. Because it's not free to make podcasts, unfortunately. So yeah. So share this podcast, bring up my views so I can monetize and downloads. No, just kidding. I really just want you to listen and share this podcast if you enjoy it, honestly. The next thing, discovering I might have autism or have autism, be on the spectrum for autism. I found a really interesting video on YouTube, and I'm just gonna run through it. I'm not gonna give little ad libs or thoughts around it. I'm just gonna read off the notes that I took from this video. I've again included in the playlist for y'all of signs you could be autistic and not know. 1, you're sensitive to sensory stimuli, especially lights and sounds. So like lights, sounds, too much of it could be really bothersome for you. You notice small details that other people don't seem to notice. 3, that was number 2. 3, you might consider yourself a highly sensitive person. 4, you have many interests that you're very enthusiastic about and find it hard to pick just one to focus on. 5, things that are easy to most people feel extremely difficult or overwhelming for you. 6, you always felt like an outsider but could never really identify why. 7, you've lost friends without realizing what you did or what went wrong. 8, you need time to recharge from social interactions. 9, when you are stressed or overwhelmed, you tend to explode in a way that feels out of character for you. 10, you have a hard time letting things go or tend to overanalyze situations. 11, your tone of voice or facial expressions don't always match or align with what you're saying or trying to say, and is often misinterpreted or thought of as rude or inappropriate. 12, you have a hard time doing daily tasks or getting organized. 13, you took an interest in things that would be considered weird or obscure, maybe as a child, according to the rest of the society. Like maybe you had a fascination with, I don't know, Dungeons and Dragons, or a specific fantasy novel or cartoon. You get super invested in those specific things that you're almost a subject matter expert on those things. 14, you've been given labels like weird, quirky, shy, or even sometimes rude. 15, you don't feel the need to conform with society's standards as it relates to gender or sexuality. 16, you have a habit of skin picking or fidgeting, as I scratch my head. Habit of skin picking or fidgeting or not sitting still. It's hard for you to notice when you've been manipulated or are being manipulated. 18, you identify with all of these traits. Y'all, before, as you're listening to this, I want you to know these things are not if you do these things, you for sure are on the spectrum. That creator has even said she's not an expert. She specifically herself, she does have autism spectrum disorder, or she is on the spectrum, as well as diagnosed with ADHD. So these things are not necessarily a end all be all independently. Each one could be telling us something entirely different. Doesn't necessarily mean you're on the spectrum. But I just at the end when she says, if you identify with all these things, it was yes. So yeah, there was that. The next thing that made me realize that I might also be on the spectrum is that sometimes if you have ADHD already, sometimes some of your traits in autism can kind of, or your I don't know, symptoms or traits relative to being on the spectrum almost kind of cancel out or balance the symptoms of ADHD. So some of the things that, I don't want to say overlap, but things that have made it, I guess, maybe harder to identify that I may have both of these diagnoses. And again, I have not received an official diagnosis. I have looked into a lot of this. I've taken assessments. gotten really high scores. So it's just a matter of me really finding a therapist and getting an official diagnosis if that's something I choose to do. Again, some of the things that I feel like, or that I'm learning, or just based on research or videos that I watched of traits that I feel like balance my ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, thus making it hard to really notice that I have both, is one, that I can be extremely talkative and outgoing with people, but I can also be very socially anxious and like even isolate myself and like really just hermit mode. And to people that often looks like, oh, it just takes a while to warm up to people, but it's like to an extreme where like I just really don't want to be around anybody. Like I'd rather be in my own company versus like, oh, I want to go out. I want to have a good time. I want to go socialize. Like literally both ends of the spectrum I've been. Not speaking literally when it comes to autism spectrum disorder, but I've been on both ends of that. Okay. Second thing, having everything out of order and chaotic versus being extremely detailed and organized. So, and these things are really, I learned in one of the videos from one of these creators of, the signs that you might have both ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. Sometimes my house or things will just get really chaotic and disorganized, and I will just leave it until it like needs to be addressed. But at the same time, I am like, I can't have disorder and mess for too long, or it becomes extremely overstimulating for me, and just really like irks me. Sometimes I can't even sleep unless the room is clean. So like it's literally, I like as someone say, a neat freak, and like things need to be very specific and done in a very specific way, or I'm just like, whatever, let the chaos be. So it's almost like they kind of balance each other out. Again, like I was saying earlier. The next thing, I'm either overstimulated or like understimulated. So either there's too much going on, there's too much noise, there's too much light, there's too much, movement, there's too many things going on in my brain, or there's not enough. Like I need background noise, and I need to be on my phone while I'm like watching the TV. Like it's really one or the other. It's really strange. Those are just some of the things. So the channels that I've used and really referred to in order to make this video or podcast, or this episode, I should say, were one, YoSamD Sam, two, Dr. Tracy Marks. One of her videos, I mentioned this earlier, but one of the videos in the playlist, I believe it's the one of like ADHD versus ASD. She has in the description those assessments that I was referring to that can kind of help you gauge whether or not you may have a diagnosis of either ADHD or be on the spectrum. Yeah, go check those videos out. The next one, there's actually a TED Talk by Martha Barnard Ray that's pretty much gone viral, and she's talking about being late diagnosed with ADHD. It's really good. It's also in that playlist. Autism from the Inside is another channel of a guy who was diagnosed with autism a few years back, has built a community of people who also have autism spectrum disorder, really around the globe, because I believe he's based out of Australia. And then How to ADHD. She also has a lot of really good videos about ADHD, but she has a TED Talk too. I don't know if it's on her channel, but you can search. I'm so sorry. I don't remember the name of the girl who runs that channel, but the channel is called How to ADHD. So I'll list those in the description as well as the show notes so that you guys can refer to them. And also, again, they're in the playlist. I think there's at least one or two videos from each of those channels on that playlist, so they're easy to reference. Before I get into this next segment, because this next segment is going to be about masking, what is all of that. Did you all know, and I learned this is actually in that TED Talk with Martha Barnard Ray that I listed just a few moments ago, that when it comes to ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, that for many years, up until literally the late 90s, so if you're a millennial in your lifetime, it wasn't until late 90s, mid to late 90s, that they actually started including female-born subjects in their research and data when it comes to autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. So a lot of the tendencies and I guess traits and symptoms really in the presentation, as they refer to it, the presentation of these specific disorders show up differently in men than they do in women a lot of times. Most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. I'm sorry. I shouldn't say men or women. Male subjects, male born versus female born subjects. Okay. It's because of that fact that there's not actually, it's still in process. There's not an extensive amount of research and data to validate certain diagnoses, or I guess to back up or validate the diagnosis of a woman with autism spectrum disorder or ADHD. So in other words, women or female born people did not really receive the validation or the diagnosis that they needed earlier in life to really manage their symptoms. More often than not, it was just like they were made to think that there was just something wrong with him and they didn't know why because there was no answers. And it's just crazy to me that, like, I mean, it's not crazy to me because of the society that we live in and how it is a patriarchal society that we're in, where women are often an afterthought. Women, mothers. So it's because of that fact that so many women, specifically mothers, are now coming forward and realizing, because when you become a mother and you have all of these things added to your plate, you maybe have spent most of your life managing your symptoms well, whether that be with ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. You may have been able to manage those well up until that point, but once you become a mother and you don't have to only worry about yourself, you have other extremely dependent people relying on you, and you feel like things are just completely unmanageable. It's because of that fact that so many women, specifically after having children, are realizing that they have these disorders. Like, they're being diagnosed late because of those two reasons, right? Like, well, not because of those two reasons, but because there was not enough research and data to back this up. And it's literally like we're in the process of learning these things as we go. So that's part of the reason why some of these channels that I've listed to you will say, like, you don't necessarily need to go to a therapist or a psychologist to get a diagnosis, because they might not even know that you have autism spectrum disorder or ADHD because there's not enough research. Like, all of the schooling they received taught nothing about these things because it never considered female born subjects. Like, that is wild to me. That is mind blowing. So what does that mean then, right? Like, how do these women not know that they had these things? Well, obviously, like I said, the research. But the other reason why is because a lot of women have done what's called masking. And masking is essentially when you learn to hide the specific symptoms that are a result of your disorder in an attempt to seem more normal. And a lot of us didn't intentionally start hiding our behaviors. It was that they were trained out of us. So a perfect example of this for me would be that I was terribly, terribly shy as a child. Like, I did not want to talk to people. And my mom would, like, force me to go talk to people. She would force me, like, you need to go out there and you need to talk to people, because, like, in everyday life, you have to do that. And even now, the idea of having to engage in conversation with people and have like social interactions, sometimes I have to practice in my mind what I'm going to say, or like I will imagine the scenarios and what I would say in that scenario, like to that extent. And nobody would know that, but that's something that I struggle with internally. I have had a hard time with knowing what is too much eye contact versus not enough eye contact. Because as a child, I would always kind of look away, and my mom, she had a very authoritarian parenting style, so disciplinarian, as some would call it. But she would say, look at me when I'm talking to you. Look at me when I'm talking to you. And I learned that I had to maintain eye contact, that it was not acceptable to not maintain eye contact. Not only that, it's encouraged to maintain eye contact when you're talking to people in customer service, which is where a majority of my experience lies. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about like, okay, am I looking at them too much? Like if I notice that I'm like staring too much, I'll like look away. Or if I notice that I'm like looking off into the distance, you might notice that now that I'm mentioning it in my videos, like I tend to look off as I'm processing, not because I'm looking at a screen and reading stuff. It's because I'm like processing my thoughts. So yeah, that's another thing. Another thing I learned to do to, hide some of these behaviors, or in other words, mask, specifically ADHD, is like learning not to talk too much. They say, if you're talking too much, like you're just talking about yourself, or like you talk way too much. Or in school, like I would literally get those progress reports. They would say like, oh, she's so smart, she's so, I would just get A's and B's across the board all the time with the subjects. But when it came to like my behavior, it was always like satisfactory. It was never outstanding because I talked too much. It was always, oh, she talks too much. She talks too much in class. She talks too much. And now I talk a lot. So I had to learn to like, okay, Amber, be mindful, like you're talking too much. Another thing when it comes to masking is people pleasing or mirroring. So because of the fact that maybe I felt like awkward or weird or an outsider, my tendency to want to act and be and dress and look a certain way was a result of trying to fit in other words, people pleasing, but also mirroring people. So like doing what they do and picking up on their habits and behaviors and then doing those same things because it seems normal. It seems acceptable. One of the last things that I feel like I really did a lot to mask was, to this day, I don't really show my personality too much. Like I try to maintain a very like cool, calm, collected, intellectual front, I should say. Not that I'm not those things, but like my weird, awkward, like really talkative, wild side has only been seen by people closest to me. And only now, by showing that side of myself on TikTok, have I started to realize and start to attract other people who are that same way. So it's really interesting, like, that whole sense of community, which brings me to my next point, is that really what happens when you unmask or remove the mask is that you're learning that a lot of the behaviors or the things that make you you are perfectly fine. They don't need to be changed. They don't need to be hidden. You don't need to try to act a certain way to be around certain people, to look normal or feel normal. You just got to be you. And people can take it or leave it. And something about becoming a mother gives you this mindset of like, I have too many important things in my life to focus on, like my children, to give a damn about what you think about me. Like your like tolerance for bullshit just like goes way down. It's like almost on the floor after you have kids. I feel like it's really interesting. But that's really what it is like when you learn to become your most authentic self, you're learning to let go of the mask. And it's scary, honestly, because there's two things actually. And I talked about this on a TikTok. But in the book, The Myth of Normal, that I'm actually reading at the moment, our brains are hardwired to need two things for survival. The first thing is authenticity, and the second thing is attachment. Now, authenticity, in regards to the way he explains it in the book, is the need to be your most authentic self as far as trusting your intuition, being open and willing and able to express any range of emotions, and really just, not trying to be a certain way in order to survive, more or less. It's just being as you are. Now, the next thing, attachment, is our deep rooted need for connection with other people. This is a means to survival because we need people to take care of us and vice versa. We need people to take care of. That's how we survive, right? That's deep rooted in our, I guess you can say, genetics in our brain. So our need for connection as well as authenticity, being able to express who we are freely and truly without having to hide or change ourselves. Those two things are necessary for our survival and for us to thrive. However, our brain will prioritize having attachments for survival over our authenticity, which looks like staying or having to maintain a connection with a person, whether that be a parent figure, a friend, a significant other, even if it means that we cannot be our truest, most authentic self or meet or have our needs met, really our deepest emotional, physical needs, our brain will still may want to maintain an attachment to that person to our own detriment, because our brain will prioritize that, which is why when you start to unmask and you start to heal, it is a necessity to begin to break those attachments that are keeping you from being your most authentic self, from having your needs met, from trusting your intuition, from being able to express yourself fully and not feeling like you need to change or be a certain way in order to be loved and cared for. So, because it's so hard and our brains are like conditioned or hardwired to prioritize that, it hurts like hell to cut off those attachments that we're so deeply connected to. But I'll tell you what, your brain, because it's hardwired to seek out attachments, will seek out new attachments. But the more you feed into being your most authentic self, true to yourself, the easier, I should say, it's going to be to not want attachments in your life that don't serve your authenticity, that don't, I guess, allow you to continue to be your most authentic self. So there's a need to make new attachments. And when those two things, so the thing about it is when there's a sort of cognitive dissonance, right? When you are maintaining attachments but not being your most authentic self, it can lead to feelings of depression. It can lead to addiction. It's just really all of the mental health issues that are very prevalent in our society today. And I guess that doesn't go without saying that if you can come to a place where you learn to let go of those coping mechanisms and really just things that you do to keep yourself from being who you are meant to be outside of what everybody and everything has told you you're supposed to be in order to quote unquote survive in society or be accepted. When you learn to do that, but also to form new attachments that help your authenticity flourish, that right there is where you want to be. That's where we thrive as humans. That's where we find true peace and fulfillment and joy and happiness. So that's part of the reason. And it's funny because I learned that after starting this podcast and really being committed to the mission that is really behind this podcast, but it just validates why I feel that this is so important, right? Why it's so important to heal, especially as mothers, and also why I'm really committed to creating a community for us so that we can all start to heal together and then create new attachments with each other that help us thrive and become our most authentic self so that we can step into our power. So what now, right? After all of this information, did you hear something that was like, oh my gosh, that sounds like me? Oh my gosh, maybe I have ADHD, maybe I have autism, maybe I'm on the spectrum, all of those things. First things first, do your research, do your research, do your research. So I gave you some resources, obviously, as I've mentioned multiple times in this episode. You can also search on TikTok, given that, I mean, it's not banned yet. So hopefully that won't happen, but you can search on TikTok, hashtag ADHD, signs of ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, ASD, late diagnosed ASD, all of those things, masking. You can search those hashtags on TikTok. I don't know that you can search it on Instagram, to be honest. Instagram, I believe their SEO is not as effective as like TikToks and YouTubes at the moment. You can Google, like really just Google. But I mentioned this earlier in the episode that you can absolutely seek an official diagnosis. You can go and seek a therapist and go through that process, but know that it's going to take time if you're not already in therapy to get an official diagnosis, because that therapist has to take time to get to know you. They can't just give you an immediate diagnosis. But from what I understand in the research that I've done, self-diagnosis is just as valid. I won't say just as valid, but is definitely valid. And you don't necessarily need an official diagnosis to be able to work on whatever coping strategies or different mechanisms to help you manage your symptoms and really make your life easier. You don't necessarily need to have an official diagnosis to be able to do those things or implement those things in your life. If it's going to make your life easier, why not try it? And if it works, great. That's fantastic. If you want me to do an episode about things that I have done to help me manage my diagnosis, and quite honestly, it went undetected for a really long time. The only reason I really brought it up to my therapist is it wasn't because I was like struggling terribly. It was because I just saw these videos and was like, I relate to a lot of those things, so maybe I have it. And as she was reading out the questions, I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. That means I have ADHD, but I do this so that I don't do that. So like throughout my life, I've really come up with a handful of coping strategies to help me manage my life better, if I could put it that way, help me to manage my life better. So if you want to know more about that and the things that I have done in my life that have worked for me, I'd be happy to do an episode on that, especially if this episode was really helpful for you in realizing that maybe you also either have ADHD or are on the spectrum. Lastly, another thing you can do is really find community. I'm sure there's Facebook groups. I don't like Facebook these days. But there's Facebook groups, TikTok, you search those hashtags, you might find like coaches or people that have created community. I would like to work on creating community, not specifically for neurodivergent people, although that would definitely be something that I think is important to have. But yeah, do your research and search on those kinds of things, comment on videos, ask people about communities they found. I wish I had more answers for you as far as communities you can participate in. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, at the beginning of this episode, please, 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 if you enjoyed this episode, leave a review, leave a comment on the YouTube videos, give me a rating if you want to. I appreciate it. And let me know, what were some of the takeaways? What were some things that stood out to you? And maybe what are some of the things that you're going to do following this video? Or I should say this episode, because it's also on a podcast. So you might not be watching it, you might be listening to it. And again, you can follow me on socials. My name is just at Mom's New Identity on Instagram and TikTok. But I think that pretty much concludes our episode for today. I appreciate you all listening, if you listened this far, and let's continue to grow, heal, and redefine motherhood on our terms. Mom's New Identity podcast is written, directed, and produced by your host, Amber Ivana. Intro music, Madre Creator, is written and performed by Heidi Rojas Music.